Andrejevic, did I get that right? Yes. Who's a professor of media studies in the School of Film, Media and Journalism, and today he's going to be talking to us about this concept of framelessness, so looking at how emerging technologies such as VR and AI and 360 video kind of deal with framelessness and the potential bias that can be kind of captured in attempting to move towards framelessness content, and looking at some of the implications of this as well. So I'm probably not going to hack this content to death any further. I'm going to hand over to Mark if you'd like to join me in welcoming him.
Thanks so much. Thanks for inviting me over to talk. I hope this will be the beginning of ongoing conversations. I think the work that you all doing is super interesting. And I thought, when I was thinking about what it might be useful to talk about, I thought, we'll see how it works, that maybe a conceptual theoretical presentation around some of the ways that I'm thinking about automation in particular might be interesting. And this particular aspect of my thinking has an aesthetic dimension, so I thought that might be the basis for some interesting back and forth. And then it might connect with some of the areas that you're interested in. So, I was thinking of calling this the aesthetics of framelessness. And I'm interested in the aesthetic dimension of framelessness. I'm interested in the ambition to capture, to imagine representation in its possibilities as frameless. But as you'll see, there's a kind of critical subtext where what I'm really trying to point to is the impossibility of framelessness, right? That's wrapped up in the aspiration to framelessness. So that's the kind of theoretical frame for the discussion. And I'm going to start by thinking about how frameless is mobilized. The promise of framelessness is mobilized as a critique of the limitations of the frame. And I'm actually going to relate that to the figure of the subject as an inframed figure. That there's a certain kind of finitude, limitation, subjectivity, partiality that's associated with the subjective perspective that's inherently framed. And that the challenge to that, or the framelessness in a sense, pushes against that quote-unquote limitation of the subject. I'm going to return to that and suggest that framing finitude and partiality as a limitation has some inherent problems, but I'll get to that a little bit later. I start with this. It's a kind of it's an example from a couple of years ago, but there are some more current examples that I'll show you that I think are interesting. But what I'm interested in is the marketing rhetoric around this technology. It popped up on my computer as a pop-up ad. Could this tiny company be the next hot stock? The answer is no. I think it's gone and done with. I don't know if it's, but it was a device called LifeLogger. And it was portrayed as a thing that you wear that will record your life as you go about the course of your day. And what interested me was the rhetorical framing of this. How much of your life do you remember? The answer is statistically around 0.001%, and that's if you have a good memory. This is about to be changed by a startup company called LifeLogger, which could be the next big thing. That struck me as quite interesting, the framing of the figure of the subject as limited, we know that, as finite, but the function of memory, right, which is selective, is featured as its flaw. That seemed to me to be quite. Look at you human flesh organism. You can only remember such a tiny piece of what happens, and that makes you, I don't know, so incomplete or so. You're missing out so much in terms of your memories. And the problem that comes up here, of course, is if you imagine the idea of having your life recorded. The figure here, the literary figure here that you may have encountered is Funes the Memorious, the Borges parable. I don't know if you've come across this. Funes falls off the horse, hits his head, and then he remembers everything, which poses a problem because he can't think abstractly, but also remembering a day takes a day, and which then causes some problems. So the question here that this raises, well, it's going to remember all this stuff for you, but it'll be where? I don't know, in the cloud somewhere. So how do you know what you want to remember? There's a second order question here about how you enframe what it is that you want to remember. And their answer was biometric. That there would actually be a device that recorded your physiological level of response or arousal, and that would be encoded into the memory. So you could go back and say, well, you know, what memories really affected me? And it will pop them up for you. But you could imagine other possible systems, because this is actually a familiar problem. A glut of information, how do you manage it? Automated systems that can do things like collaborative filtering, crowdsourcing, and so on. Other people who liked memories like this also like these memories, and then become a prosthetic memory that would call up the memories for you. But what I'm intrigued by is the framing of the flaw of the selectivity, the subjectivity, as being the weakness, and I'm going to suggest some of the ways in which the critique of the frame is actually become quite familiar in contemporary discourses of thinking about how information functions. The inherent flaw is the framed character of it, which we might also describe as the bias or the partiality. And this is a meme that was circulating really in right-wing circles. But what struck me was the way in which it offered a particular road into thinking about the way in which the fake news world is configured. And I'll say what I mean by that. So it goes something like this, right? You see this picture, right? And then you've got the whole picture, in a sense. Whole picture? Well, not exactly. But the way this circulates as a meme is how the media can manipulate our viewpoint. All media representations are partial. All media representations cannot give you the whole 360-degree picture. By that token, they are all partial, right? That raises openings for undermining what you might call the symbolic power of media narratives or media accounts, or maybe narrative in general, right? Donald Trump uses this quite a bit. Some people say it's not the whole picture. I don't know, could be this, right? It's a way of destabilizing dominant narratives, so it has a critical use. But in the current context of kind of information saturation, it also has its propaganda uses, right? Yes, that's the account, but we know it's only partial, so we don't have to believe it. In fact, until we know everything, we get to choose. Right? That would be one way that you could take the argument. In terms of critiquing in terms of the aspiration for framelessness, what I'm going to try to do here is create a constellation of examples that are meant to suggest or meant to invoke a pattern of an aspiration towards framelessness that what I'm hoping will do will generate maybe examples that you've come across, but at least will demonstrate a pattern of what I'm thinking about is this aspiration to framelessness. This is from a company called SensiLab that has the weirdest video. I went to the site to try to figure out how they were promoting themselves. The video is so weird, but it's just like little shots of the landscape, but everywhere there's a little text indicating like either where crimes could happen or this thing, your crime priorities. What are your crime priorities? What intrigued me about this company is that it's one of these predictive policing companies. So it contracts to law enforcement agencies. But what it does is it tries to fold in forms of data that go far beyond the standard predictive policing algorithms, which rely, basically on past patterns of criminal activity in order to predict future patterns, and there are all kinds of flaws with that. As we know, over-policing certain areas will lead to data sets that would bias the predictive algorithms towards those areas that have been, I don't know if over-policed is the word, but saturation policed. What intrigued me about is the other things that they fold in. It includes, in addition to data on past criminal activity, factors such as population density, census data, the locations of bars, churches, schools, and transportation hubs, schedules for home games, even moon phases. I like that. It's kind of like, I mean, the approach is there is no limit on what might be a relevant factor, so let's fold it all in, right? And then let the correlational findings sort it out. Throw all the data in and let the algorithm sort it out. You've probably come across this example in various guises. One study got a fair amount of publicity a while back when I think it was IBM. They kind of high turnover for call centers, and they're trying to figure out how to screen employees better. And so they just dumped all of the data from their online application forms into a system that would correlate any piece of information from those forms with so they had the past forms, and then they had the subsequent job performance evaluations and the retention rates for employees. And so they just looked for correlations, and they used everything on the form, which included metadata about what browser was used to fill out the form. And it turns out that metadata had the highest level of correlation with subsequent job performance, higher than all the stuff that people were actually filling in. And the correlation was around the browser. And what they found was that using browsers that had to be installed rather than ones that came preloaded correlated to higher retention and higher and better, and that was for this particular category. But what intrigued me about that was the idea of dumping all the data in. And I don't think they even meant particularly to put the browser data in. It just happened to be part of the metadata that came with the data set. But you get where I'm going with this, right? There's no reason for ruling out a priori what information might be relevant, which means collect it all, right? Which is moving in the direction of what I'm thinking about as framelessness, right? My touchstone on this, because I come at this through the lens of surveillance studies. That's one of the areas that I work in. Is the Gus Hunt, former chief technical officer of the FBI. We try to collect everything and hang onto it forever. And his rationale for this is he actually references in this talk Google. He's like, we're inspired by Google because we think that our old model of search and winnow, we collect data and we throw away irrelevant data, actually is not appropriate for the current information environment because we have the capability to do things differently. But also, if we're going to be using automated systems for finding correlations, when we throw data out, we lose the potential of finding, he puts it this way, of connecting the dots. And on the speculative possibilities that they're going to get more data, you wouldn't want to throw away any of the unconnected dots because the new data might connect with the old data in ways that you miss out on if you don't hold on to it forever. To me, that's an interesting statement of framelessness. Collect everything, hold on to it forever. Right? It's like LifeLogger. So you see, I'm trying to come up with these homologies. I don't know. Did you guys see the Kevin Kelly piece a couple of weeks back? It's such a. This feels so retro. This piece to me because in the wake of kind of contemporary critiques of the platform economy and so on, he really writes it. It's like going back to the 1990s and reading the kind of like cool utopian stuff that doesn't think about potential downsides. But it's about augmented reality, and so he describes this as mirror world, and he describes it in a very cheerful, upbeat way. We are now at the dawn of the third platform. Third platform is reality becomes the augmented platform, right? So the forms of interactivity and information display and collection that take place online can be overlaid onto the physical world. We're now at the dawn of the third platform, which will digitize the rest of the world. On this platform, all things and places will be machine readable, subject to the power of algorithms. It's really interesting to me that he says, all things and places. And it's like, what about people? why are people in there? And I was thinking, maybe he just assimilates those to things, I'm not sure. But in order to make that happen, of course, you need framelessness, right? I don't have any good, all the representations of framelessness are funny because they actually aren't frameless. And maybe that's part of the theme here. But to recreate a map that is big as the globe, and he invokes, just to talk about Borges, he invokes the inexactitude in science that Baudrillard draws on. To recreate a map that is as big as the globe in 3D, no less, you need to photograph all places and things from every possible angle all the time. What a cool aspiration. Which means you need to have a planet full of cameras that are always on. So that's another interesting statement of framelessness. It's got to be, not only do you have to have every angle from everywhere, but it's got to be all the time because these things are, it's constantly changing. you can think of all the different ways in which this ambition manifests itself, from the micro to the macro, backing a plan to have video cameras watch every inch of Earth from space. And then, this example came up because I just read a study, it just came out today, I think, that was about smart speakers. I don't know if anybody saw it, but apparently the penetration rate of smart speakers in Australia is outstripping everybody. Like it's moving super fast here. But the idea of finding ways to collect information from spaces that were hitherto opaque and not available to the forms of information collection that in this case we would be talking about marketing, right? I think some of the same logics apply, right? Collect everything and hold on to it forever is not just a security rationale, it's also a commerce rationale. This is, I picked Google Home because it turns out that in Australia, in contrast to the US, which is one of the other big adopters, Google Home is outstripping Amazon Alexa. I just like these kind of creepy patents that these companies file around what they're going to do with the data. A smart home system to monitor and control everything from screen time and hygiene habits, cool, to meal and travel schedules and other activities. I put up a couple of stuff that people who go through the patents have found out, recommending products. This is Google Home patents. Again, these are notional, right? As far as I know, none of these are actually operational. Based on furnishings observed by a smart home security camera, new video feeds from smart devices to determine users' behaviors and characteristics, including gender, age, fashion taste, and so on. Smart devices that target advertisements based on the title of the book by a user's bedside. The reason of piling these examples on is to drive home that point of framelessness. Everything, every detail, everything that can be captured. These are the stats. I just thought this was interesting because it came out today. It was so rapid in 2018 that the user base relative population exceeds the US, which was, one of the places where this was being pioneered. At the end of December, there were about 5.7 million Australians. That means almost 30% of all Australian adults have access to a smart speaker, up from 0 18 months prior. That's a pretty fast penetration rate for the technology. And Google Home is the one that's leading here. It probably has to do with with the different presence of Amazon in the US versus here. This one really intrigued me because there's a kind of psychoanalytic element to this. This was at the Consumer Electronics Show. Again, it was trying to go beyond what it is that your own memory can capture, and it's not just what your memory can capture by virtue of the limitations on your attention and observation and so on, but actually the limitations on your formation as a subject. Right? Like it takes a certain point before you start to register memories in ways that are retrievable, and people saw this as like that's a flaw. What if you could go back and retrieve the memories that happened before you were forming memories in ways that are retrievable? And so it's such a creepy photo, that's why I like it too. The idea is the baby, not a doll, but an actual baby, would wear this, and the little teddy bear has a camera that captures what the baby sees so that you can go back and see the memories that occurred before you were the type of subject that could form memories. It's an interesting Freudian thing here, right? Like somehow capture the original trauma or something. I get like a completely externalized unconscious, right? Like my unconscious is here. I can go retrieve all the things that it saw that have led to my subsequent situation. I won't spend actually time on this, but okay, I got it there. This was a kind of enthusiastic article about the future of education, and I'm interested in the way some of these technologies are being used in schools. But again, it's a weird article because it sounds so dystopian when I read it, but maybe that's just me, but it was so enthusiastic. But what it does is just pile on these examples of the forms of sensors that are going to be collecting information about students in schools. Imagine classrooms outfitted with cameras that run constantly, capturing each child's every facial expression, fidget, and social interaction every day, all year long. Then imagine on the ceilings of these rooms infrared cameras documenting the objects that every student touches, recording every word that each person utters. And then, but wait, there's more. Children themselves wearing Fitbit-like devices that track everything from their heart rates to their time between meals. For about a quarter of the day, the students use Chromebooks and learning software. I get old retro stuff, the actual devices that collect information. But imagine putting all those things together, right? It's trying to assemble a world, right, in a a kind of frameless world. So I was trying to think what happens to representation in a way. A lot of these examples that I've portrayed for you have to do with thinking about how does representation function in a context of framelessness. How do you represent something that seems to overflow the bounds of representation? You can store it, that seems feasible, but how do you represent it? And it's intriguing to me that alongside the aspiration of framelessness that I've tried to identify for you by, piling example on top of example, that we have forms of representation that seem to aspire to framelessness, right? I would argue that they don't get there. I would argue, in fact, that that's impossible, right? But what I want to point to is an aspiration which might exist in the context of a kind of self-contradiction, but we can recognize the aspirational character. And cameras that capture everything from every angle. How do you represent, once you've captured everything from every angle, what are the forms that representation can take? Well, we know that all these representations are actually for situated subjects, which inherently claps a frame back onto what it is that's being represented. So even if you're not in a 360 environment or a VR environment, right, what you see is going to be framed by your subject position, right? But the frame exists at that point, projected back into the subject, not necessarily in the representation itself. Although you'd probably argue that there are frames in the representation as well. I was trying to think of technologies that aspire to collect information framelessly, right? Again, all cameras are situated. They're just in the very way they capture information, right? So how do you escape this kind of constraint of the frame, either in the subject or in the recording object? And I don't know. I don't have a good answer to that. But if you've got any thoughts, I'd be very interested. But I can tell you one of the technologies that keeps coming up when I think about it is the speculative technology, which is it's funny because we've all encountered it, and I think it seems kind of weird and creepy. But this, or maybe cool, I'm not sure. This smart dust technology? Have you heard about, if you could shrink sensors down to a level that that you could just distribute them in space. And they may not float. I guess down the road, the goal is to make them so tiny they float. That seems, or I don't know, maybe equip them with little whatever, feathers or something, so they float, whatever it was that would suspend them in a breeze. But the idea of just scattering sensors around space so that they could retrieve information of different kinds, whatever is embedded in the sensor. I've got a little clip here. I'll show it quick just because it's, I don't know, it has that kind of tech hokiness to it. Will that work? No, sorry. How do I?
Did you just get into the play button? Bottom left.
Oh, where am I?
There.
I can do this. Oh, we don't have sound.
Buildings suspended in the sky are intelligent use of future real estate. But in the future, every square inch of every city will be alive with intelligence. Because every street and every building will have a network of microcomputers built right into them. Dr. Chris Piester calls it smart dust.
A smart dust particle or mote is a wireless sensor with sensing, computation, communication, and power in one package.
These all-in-one microcomputers will be small, very small.
The size of a mote today is about the size of a grain of rice. And we've shown that we can make the circuitry small enough and light enough that eventually it will be possible to make things that are on a 7mm size scale.
Tiny specks of computer smart dust will form a vast invisible network that can help manage the infrastructure of even the largest city.
Smart cities in the future will take this low power, inexpensive, small technology and basically distribute it everywhere.
These tiny computers record information about their surroundings, information they can send to other computers or to you. Smart dust on the tracks will monitor your commuter train so you know if it's running late. Potholes will be able to report themselves and warn your car, and you'll never have to wait for a radio traffic report again.
They're monitoring the flow of traffic.
There are easier
And
ways
give
to
you
do
alerts
that.
about what route is the right way to go to keep the traffic moving.
Bridges will get a coating of smart dust particles that can warn us when they detect stress fractures, helping avoid deadly collapses. But smart dust will also allow buildings and streets to recognize you and respond accordingly.
I think increasingly the environment will respond to who we are and adapt in consequence. The city will know where you are if you want it to.
Your workplace will know you. Smart dust at the entrance will boot up your computer. And smart dust embedded in the elevator doors will automatically ring your floor.
Smart dust is going to sense the environment and allow us to improve the way that we live our lives.
Okay. I first came across smart dust when I was looking at military forms of surveillance, and that was when I saw it first being proposed as actually a system for urban warfare, with the idea that, how do you see inside buildings? Well, if you could spray sensors inside the building, you could kind of reconfigure what that space looked like without having visual access or having to enter the space. So, like many technologies, many media and information technologies, I think there's a military basis there. Anyway, what's intriguing to me about the figure of smart dust, and again, I think it's maybe more, symbolic character of it, is that it's meant to be distributed and frameless in its application. Like, it can go everywhere. It can be everywhere. In fact, the goal is that the atmosphere through which we move becomes redoubled as both a form of sensor and a medium of interaction. But that idea of a completely distributed, how would you represent what it is that smart dust senses? This is an interesting question. I mean, I guess it would be through replication of an environment. But here's what I'm going to suggest, and I'm drawing on the artist TREVOR PAGLEN and the work that he's done based on his interest in the filmmaker FAROCKI. And he borrows this concept of the operative image from FAROCKI. And FAROCKI is interested in how machines see. And he does this film series, iMachine 1, 2, 3, I think, where he looks at different devices and how they represent for themselves, but with a human interface, what it is that they see. And so the movie is it's a kind of big industrial and military equipment and the various interfaces that they have to show how they're sensing studs in a wall or targets or whatever. And he describes these images made neither to he's interested in the fact that they're, as he would put it, non-ideological, or we could say maybe that's not the case. We decide what is it that's being seen, but he's interested in that they're not meant to entertain or to inform. They're actually part of an operation. They're meant to be an intermediate step between the machine doing one thing and the machine doing the other. And the fact that the human sees it is almost incidental to what happens. And so TREVOR PAGLEN goes back and he tries to recreate about a decade later some of the work that FAROCKI does by doing research on how machines are representing what they see to humans. And he comes up with this conclusion: meat eyes are far too inefficient to see what's going on anyway. So the operational image, and here we put image in scare quotes or something, right? Like, well, there's some type of a data image that's become part of an operation. But to try to portray that in a symbolic way to human subjects becomes overly, involved or complicated or all but impossible because of the complexity of the forms of data. It's not just a visual image. It would be, smart dust would capture probably sound. We could imagine, toxic materials, air pressure, all of these things combined. So when you get an operational image, and this is the operational image, of course, to get back to the opening gambit of the talk, is becomes non-subjectifiable, right? It becomes inaccessible to the subject as a viewpoint. And I'm interested in what happens when the image moves from having what you might call representational or symbolic content to having only operational content. What space is closed down there? Because I guess I'm a media studies person. I'm interested in logics of representation. This is an image this is one of Trevor Paglen's image. And he does a lot of stuff with machine vision. But this is an image classifier that he's trained on Duchamp, right? This is another iteration of the Cécile Pazimpique, right? The more famous version of Cécile Pazimpam. Of course, there's a reflexive representation about representation character to the Duchamp. What's interesting to me is the way, here's an apple, but wait, that's not an apple. This is an image of an apple. The image classifier just comes in and says, red and green apple, right? And it's a kind of a silly example, but you get where I'm going with this. From an operational perspective, you don't have that space between whatever that space is, that's the space of reflecting upon representation, right? Where you can say, that's an apple, but it's actually not an apple. You have the classifier saying, this is an apple. You get into interesting, I suppose, discussions. You could take it further and say, well, okay, what if you train the image classifier to recognize images of apples and say, this is an image of an apple. How might you do that? That becomes interesting. Or you could train it, I suppose, to differentiate between 3D and flat. But then you could have a sculpture of an apple. Where's the point when at which it's going to be possible? I suppose if you could train it to take a bite out of it, maybe or want to take a bite out of it, or want to distinguish the difference. Anyway, that's a rabbit hole to go down. But you see what I'm getting at that point. Representational images have a certain representational power, which is, I would argue, different and irreducible to their operational character, and that those two levels are characteristic of what we mean by language, or construed in the broadest sense. But may not be characteristic of machine language. That might be, or maybe that's something we can have a discussion about. The philosopher Slavoj Žižek reflects on this a little bit in ways that seem interesting or useful to me. Oh, I have a built-in timer. If in normal symbolic communication we're dealing with the distance between things and words, which opens up the space for the domain of sense, and within it for symbolic engagement, in the case of virtual reality, on the contrary, the very over proximity of the sign and the designated content disengages us, closes up the space for symbolic engagement. We could argue whether or not that's true of virtual reality, but I think when it comes to the forms of image classification I'm talking about, that's the space that's getting compacted. And the question is, what are the consequences of that? I'm going to skip that because I'm worried about time. I'll say something quick about, I'm interested in what happens when the emphasis shifts from representational to operational power, when it comes not just to machine operations, but to forms of social control, for example. The figure that probably haunts my imagination here, again, because of surveillance studies, is that of Foucault's panopticon, right? The surveillance. That's actually it's a very heavily symbolic device, right? The whole point of Foucault's panopticon is that the spectacle of the tower instills a sense of being watched and an uncertainty about whether one's being watched that really depends on the symbolic power of the panopticon to be internalized by the subjects who are at the mercy of its power, right? So we can think about the ways in which a certain version of representation and a certain version of the subject subtend that notion of what social control is, right? I experienced it directly here in my move to Australia because of all the speed cameras everywhere. I came from LA, where there weren't speed cameras, and then I arrived and got free tickets, and then I immediately started to become a good disciplined subject. Whenever I saw the towers, or actually whenever I saw the signs, I internalized the logics of control there, right? I would follow the rules. So there's a symbolic power to know. I mean, there's also an economic and state power at work too, right? But the very figure, the image of, when you go into the store and it says smile, you're on camera, right? The symbolic power there is meant to discipline subjects in a particular way, but that relies on a particular version of subjectivity. The subject would recognize the symbolic power and internalize it. What happens when you dispense with that version of subjectivity and think about other ways to operate control? And one of them, and here I'm drawing on the lectures of Foucault, some of the later lectures, talking about managing a milieu, rather than managing subjects, right? Rather than thinking about how to get subjects to internalize discipline, how do you change the milieu itself in ways that can modify behavior? And Foucault goes through this set of arguments that Masumi recaps. The dominant contemporary regime of power, coincident with the rise of neoliberalism, is environmental. A governmentality which should act on the environment and systematically modify its variables, right? Once you have information about the entire city or the entire space, the next step is to think about how that space can be varied, modulated, in order to guide, channel the activity that takes place within it, right? So the next step really, I think, from a totally monitored environment is an increasingly flexibilized environment. And that's why I think that augmented mirror world reality that Kevin Kelly is thinking about, the dimension is not just the interactive character, but not just the monitoring character, the information collection, but also the interactive character, the way in which it can put an interactive overlay which is more modulatable than physical space, but endow physical space with that character. The last thing I want to do is just make the connection between this kind of, which seems like a pretty, I don't know, I don't want to flatten these two arguments into each other, but this notion of modification of the milieu. How do you change, how do you change the online environment to induce the type of behavior that you're interested in? I put libertarian paternalism there because, I don't know, like a light version of that would be all the nudge stuff, right? And it's interesting to me that the excitement or the interest around nudge as a form of managing populations coincides with the enthusiasm around these increasingly interactive environments, because it makes sense, right? If you're able to make the environments more interactive, you can think about the ways in which acting on the milieu can be used as a form of managing, rather than relying on subjects that will internalize discipline, you can tell them the rules and they'll follow them. Because the nudge is meant to be like, you don't really even realize why you're doing it. You just kind of do it because you've been nudged that way. So just to end, the reflections here are really generated by thinking about what I'm describing as automated media. And I'm arguing that many of the logics that I'm talking about follow on from a logic that, I don't know if I would say it starts this way, but it tends to be built around the ability of interactive platforms to collect huge amounts of information passively. And once you collect those huge amounts of information, once you aspire to frameless information collection, you end up having to engage, I think, in what I'm describing as operational processes, right? Processes that have to be automated, in which to try to get some type of a subject to process all that information slows down the process so much that it becomes prohibitive. And once you have automated processing, the next step of managing environments in automated ways, automated response, seems to follow from that. And the last thing I'll say is, what I've been describing sounds kind of dystopian and extreme and maybe overblown in certain ways. And I guess that's meant to be deliberate in order to point out logics that I think that are at work. I suspect that all of these logics probably will not work, at least in the way they're promising to work. And the reason that they won't work is I think they imagine the subject or the kind of finitude and partiality is a surpassable horizon. And I don't think it is at this point. Maybe when we reach the singularity and we're all infinite beings, but all bets are off at that point. So I'll leave it at that. Thanks for your time.
Does anyone have any questions?
Yeah.
Oh,
You get first.
oh, Vince, do you have yeah, thanks. There was kind of line there. I guess I'm trying to kind of lasso it all together in my head. But I was just thinking how you ended with the nudge stuff, and of course, that kind of libertarian paternalism, I guess, follows the idea that you can change behaviour by changing the environment, because, although they don't say that, it's kind of an inheritor of the kind of the behaviour study that people just simply products of their environment.
Yeah, you're right.
So I'm just sort of thinking about that in terms of the environment creating the person, and going back to, you talked about kind of the operational vision stuff, which is also reminding me of, I don't know if you've read like Feed Forward, the Mark Hansen book, but I guess talking about that idea that now there's a kind of a second order of kind of representation, because the sensing is going on sort of beneath human kind of consciousness, and then so the media systems are doing that, and then they have to have a second kind of layer of representation of representing that to human beings, and so our kind of sensory relationship with the world just kind of has this extra layer on it. And so I guess I'm sort of not quite sure how to sort of put this together, but I'm wondering about, I guess, the relationship then between kind of a subject position, and you talk about where the subject is in those 360 kind of representations and so on, and that kind of relationship with technology and the way it marries it together. And something, it's a much more kind of benign example, but in terms of that kind of relationship, and maybe the idea that those things are dissolving into each other and you're getting less of a distinction between environmental sensing and personal sensing, is that, I think what distinguishes things like, say, AR and VR and arguably kind of all interfaces and so on, is that they're representing the user as much as they're representing things to the user. And I think VR is a good example of that, because what's kind of new about VR is not really the technology of representing the images, but the fact that it's representing the movements of the person's body. It's kind of representing the seeing in that it's, it's moving with your head and everything. It's actually the representation of you that's crucial to it, not the representation of the computer graphics and so on. And so I was thinking a kind of more benign example of where that could go is, I don't know if you've heard, but like, there's a kind of research into kind of perpetual walking. Like if you're in VR and there's a big space, how do you represent that to someone without them just walking to the wall, because they're actually in a small space? And so people have done this kind of research where they kind of bias the representation to slightly sort of tweak your orientation. So you think you're walking for a kilometre in one direction, but you're actually walking around in circles, because the representation of your head movement and so on is just tweaked that little bit. So it's kind of bending your perspective. So you
don't notice that it's bending.
Yeah, that's right. So you think you're walking straight ahead, but you're going around and around and around.
That's a beautiful example.
So like I said, that's obviously not sinister in the way that some of your things, but I think maybe it's an illustration of the way in which partly it's the fact that the systems are representing us, and that therefore they can kind of not just have a certain relationship with the environment, but they can kind of marry that kind of subject position into it by the fact that they're also, we're kind of interacting with representations of ourselves, or we're interacting with the environment through a representation of ourselves, and that's the other half of how it can kind of have that complete control. You're kind of losing a distinction between some kind of non-mediated subject position and the mediated subject position, which is kind of synthesized kind of into the representation itself. So I don't know if that's
great.
Sense, but
no, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. Well, what it makes me think of is because your point is really, I don't know, like right away I start going into, it's my own deformation into like super dystopian versions of that, right? But the idea, what you're pointing to is the way in which these environments, as you suggest, construct their own versions of subject, which actually, and we can think about all of the ways in which that happens. From that's what Amazon's doing, right? All of this is so the 360 image is not just the image on the wall, but it's the subject position as well. But there's a great, just a little anecdote that gets to my dystopian point about this, is that those subjects in themselves, I think, are kind of post-subjective. And here's what I mean by that. Like the representation ones that you're talking about. Ray Kurzweil, he's a great figure for these kind of arguments, but he's in the process not only of trying to be infinite, right? He's taking $1,000 of vitamins a day so he can live forever, but to reconstruct his father. This is a very psychoanalytic example again. By finding all the ephemera of his father's life and all the records, and create a bot that would be his father that he could talk to. And somebody asked him, well, will it be like talking to your father? And his answer is so cool. It's, it's a beautiful, again, I think psychoanalytic example. His answer is, that bot will be more like my father than my father was. And that's what I think those subjects that are being created for us are. Like, they're going to be more like us than we are. That's the point. But in that sense, what does that mean to be more like us than we are? It means to fill in whatever the gaps in the subject are, right? To overcome whatever the non-self-identical characteristics of the subject are. You can see I've got a kind of psychoanalytic framework there. But that's a great point. I think it's a super important point. Yeah.
Thank you so much. I really enjoyed your talk. I'm doing also, my research is also practice-based research about like cinematic VR. And then my research is about like, I'm really interested about reflexivity and alienation in VR. Because I think even like illusion of framelessness can be more dangerous sometimes, because even like in VR, like signified like can be blurred for the user.
Right.
So because they have a lot of like blind acceptance and like bit of more about like feels like they can be even more manipulated by from the unconscious layers. So just try to find a specific like methodology how can like 360 video or like VR can provoke more self-awareness or like or can be like outside from kind of panopticon systems. So do you have a specific example, an idea like how can just like a 360 video and VR can achieve that kind of like layer outside of like a panopticon or?
I don't know if I've got an example, but the direction that you're moving in seems really interesting in the sense that what looks to me to be the uses of VR that I would critique are those that imagine that they could reach some point of hypermediation that feels immediate, right? Although that would be one of the potential goals, right? The bad figure here that I'd invoke is Mark Zuckerberg, because he's another good bad figure. But his ideas. It was a couple of years ago at that Fate conference that he has every year. That he was saying like VR will eventually displace language communication, and the way he frames it is we'll be able to directly communicate thoughts. Like, no, you won't. That doesn't make any sense. But the idea that that's what it will do seems to me to be falling into that trap of immediation. And so the idea to think about what it means to imagine VR as a medium that's reflexive about itself, as opposed to one that's trying to subtract itself as a medium, seems like a really interesting direction. But I don't know what that would mean. I'm not sure I've got any good examples. Maybe other folks do here, but I think it's a really interesting way to think about it. What does it mean to not set yourself the problem, which seems to me to be an impossible one. Maybe I'm wrong. I could be wrong. But that it becomes utterly transparent, and that you have this kind of really weird combination of a pure transparency and a pure opacity, which is what Dan was talking about, like all the behind the scenes stuff that's making you feel like you're completely freed of mediation is somehow opaque and visible. But that does something else. That seems to me to be really interesting. That maybe might reflect on, I don't know what, the political economy of the platform that's making you imagine that your communications are transparent, or the operational systems that are doing that. But I think VR as an artistic and creative and expressive medium, that seems like a very exciting and interesting one. You again would know much more about this than I do. But it's just a weird idea that seems to be bred of a certain form of, I don't know, version of communicative capitalism, that actually its function is to become utterly transparent, unlike, or I don't know, in ways that are distinct from how that's been attempted before. Seems pathological. Yeah. So I don't know. Let me think about that. 'Cause I mean, there are probably some artists who are doing really interesting work around that. But I don't know, John might have some ideas there.
It's hard to imagine how you'd be alienated from the experience of the VR, because that's kind of its point, is to not be alienated.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as soon as you take the headset off, you're...
Well, yes, that's how you do it, I guess.
Yeah.
Or someone slaps you while you've got.
But the headset itself is such a thing, right? Like wearing the headset, I mean.
Yes, it's not really unencumbering.
Yeah. Right, you really feel it. Yeah.
Yeah, particularly if you're tethered or you're restricted in what you can do. Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
Just about your point about the irreducibility of representation, the artist's work they showed with the Magritte.
Oh yeah.
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 So why is it irreducible? Why is it irreducible between the symbolic representation and the literal representation? Why do you say that it's irreducible? Just curious.
in other words, why can't the representation be the thing itself? Why couldn't you just then have
Well,
it?
could you imagine a machine that
Yeah.
could understand that picture in the way that people understand it?
Ah, I can't, and I'll tell you why. I think it's because of desire,
Yeah.
right? But that's going to be my framework. You know, representation. One of the functions really is born of a particular type of lack, right? Why do we represent things? What's the point, right? And you know, the framework here is that actually representation is motivated, right? There's something that motivates that, and so then the question is, so that's why I threw in that crack about like biting the apple, right? You know, what? I guess here's, maybe I could imagine it, but I would have to imagine a machine that had perhaps these characteristics. It would have to be a desiring machine, right? And I think it would have to be one that mediates between some type of, I don't know, like physiological need and social need, right? Like it would have to be a social machine in ways where it couldn't function without reliance on being able to communicate to others, right? But it would have to also be a machine that had built in some type of a desire to survive. Right? Like, it has to be a machine that wanted something. Is that's and you could program a machine to want something, but I'm not like. To me, that's the space, right? What's the difference between programming a machine to want something and wanting something? Is there a difference? Maybe there's not.
I think there is.
You think there is? Okay.
Well, it's very, I mean, it's kind of it's a very, very broad question about automation.
Yeah.
And it's sort of at the heart of artificial intelligence in a way, right? Because we tend to think that even though machines have some sense of autonomy in the way that they, I mean, even in the way that they can develop and change or learn, you rarely actually see that in anything more than a very limited context. So, you know, like, because I've got an interest in machines that are creative, but the thing is that all the examples are where people are programmed to them deliberately to that. None of them want to be that or learn to be that.
That's the space.
Refuse to be that.
That's the space. Creating versus wanting to create. Yeah.
But I'm just kind of very interested in unpacking it because I don't, as the sort of scientific side of my brain says, I don't see anything that's irreducible because people do it, right? So there must be a mechanism behind it. But what is that mechanism, and how, you know, I think it is tied up to those things. It is about the fallibility and the inability to conceptualize those framelessness or those boundless things that you know is part of it. But it's still a very difficult thing to follow through to sort of match up those two views. Sort of like there's kind of quantum views of things where there's wave-particle duality. There's there's an irreducibility that could exist because it's clearly something that we do. But when you try and think about a machine that could do that, you immediately get stumped. Because obviously machines aren't like people in any real way. So, but if you're trying to make machines that interact with people at a social level, for example, which is a big area of AI, how do you go about doing that if they could never appreciate that style of representation or that gap in representation?
Yeah, I agree with you. I mean, I think that's the big question, and it's the one that I chew on in a lot of different ways. I always ask myself that question. Every time I hear like Ray Kurzweil loves to. Sorry, I don't know why.
He's kind of an outlier.
He's an outlier, but he formulates things in such clear ways, right? Like, remember when he had all those predictions back in the 90s, like a computer will beat a human at this, and we'll do that, and so on. Like some of those things came true, but like didn't want to, and I guess it really has to do with thinking about what does it mean to think about the difference between a subject. And so you can see my framework, right? It's not post-human at all. It's, but understanding the subject is existing in an environment of lack. And what does it mean to think of a machine as lacking, right? Is it, you could program a machine to attempt to do something, but does a machine exist in a context of lack in the way that a subject does? That seems to me to be like where the question would come down. And that lack seems to me to be both like physiological, maybe biological, and social. Right, at the same time. So, could you imagine a machine that had those same characteristics? You might be able to, right? I mean, it seems, I don't know, right? That question seems open to me, but it would have to be a social machine, right? It seems to me. And it would have to be a machine that always existed on the edge, as subjects do, of incompleteness and death.
But I guess the irony is that a lot of like people like Ray Kurzweil, it is all about lack for them.
Yeah.
That's what drives their thinking.
They want to be infinite.
Exactly, yeah.
And the cool thing, what I love about them is that like they think they'll still be like Ray will still be Ray when he's infinite. Like, and it's like their stuff is really I don't know. I won't get it. Like when he gets sorry.
He's a bit of an outlier.
He is an outlier. Yeah.
Perhaps you
But
guys can continue
yeah.
this conversation.
Okay. Yeah.
But maybe if
Yeah.
everyone else would like to join me
Yeah.
in thanking Mark for his time
Oh,
today.
thanks.
you.
Thanks for coming. I appreciate it. Thanks for inviting me. More fruitful conversations down the road.
I can just see this going for a while. Like it's 5
Sorry.
o'clock. And